This talk is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity as a man to stop and reflect on how the experience of the pandemic can actually awaken us to lead more meaningful lives. Before the pandemic, our lives were predictable. Every day we traveled to and from our work, and suddenly, with no notice, we completely stopped commuting and traveling. We experienced working from home and spending most of the day with our families. The patterns of our lives changed more radically than at any time in living memory. This has led to many men reflecting about their lives. And this experience, combined with the following 6 disturbing facts about males in our society, highlight why change is needed now. 80% of people who commit suicide are male, and for every man that kills someone else, there are 20 men who kill themselves. 90% of people in prisons are men. 90% of the homeless are men. 90% of those who physically or sexually abuse women and children are men. 80% of children with learning and behavioral problems are boys. And we know from the 2020 UN World Happiness Report that half the adults in the United States struggle with addictions such as alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, gaming, and most of these are men. We know that men are much more isolated than women, and that these statistics have only got worse through the lockdowns and the pandemic. There's clearly something profoundly broken with the male culture in our society, causing great suffering to women, children, and men themselves. And it's vital we understand this culture, as radical change is urgently needed. In this talk, I'm going to share 6 short stories on how we can break out of this culture. Firstly, what does the male culture teach us, and what are the consequences of this in our lives? How my life was transformed by understanding my father. Insights from the world's leading author on understanding men and raising boys. How leadership can change the culture of our working lives. The culture in which the happiest people in the world live, and the 10 steps that you can follow to live a more meaningful life. Culture is very difficult to understand as we don't really see it. I lived the first half of my life in England before we emigrated to the Netherlands. It was only after we moved that I started to notice how the English culture had profoundly shaped my thinking. In England, I used to see people and their jobs that they did in a hierarchical way. This isn't so in the Dutch culture. The male culture in industrialized countries teaches boys and men, consciously or unconsciously, only one thing. I must be tough. I must not show any weakness. This culture, it teaches us to close off from our feelings, our heart, our intuition. Humans have 4 primary emotions: mad, glad, sad, and scared. Men can never show that we're sad or scared. We find it very difficult to be open, to share our problems, to be vulnerable, to ask for support. At home, men find it difficult to express themselves and their feelings to wives, partners, children, parents, friends. At work, men struggle to give or receive praise, feedback, to admit a mistake, to have emotionally challenging conversations. In terms of our mental and physical health, men typically avoid going to the doctor, so many men are not diagnosed nor treated. This culture leads to the 3 biggest problems for men: being lonely, isolated, being emotionally timid, and 3, often because of a lack of approval from our fathers, being very competitive. All humans seek belonging and connection. That's how we're wired. We want to grow and develop and make the world a better place. But this culture says real men don't talk about developing ourselves, becoming better fathers, husbands, friends, colleagues. So we stay trapped in our culture. Ask yourself, how has this culture affected your life? I had a happy early childhood, and in my first career, I worked in 3 big organizations. I used to wake up thinking about work, drive into the office, sit at my desk or in meetings all day. We worked very much on our own, competing with each other, with little real connection. I'd then drive home, have dinner, and slump in front of the TV. Fortunately, I did have my mates, and every weekend we'd go to the pub, we'd drink beer, and we certainly had lots of fun. But we had an unwritten rule in our culture. We never talked about how our lives were really going. So we didn't share, understand ourselves, or learn from each other. And this picture captures what that period was like, a conflict between my work and my family. The biggest regret in my life is that work generally won and my family lost. How crazy is it that so many of us live our lives this way? The good news is many of the younger generations of men are starting to break this pattern by working less hours than their fathers. After 11 years with one company, I was let go, and I felt really rejected. I had exactly the same feeling much earlier in my life. When I was 8, my mother died, and by the time I was 13, my stepmother said to my father, either he goes or I go. And I was put in a local children's home when I was 13, where I lived for 5 years. Before I was let go, a woman I was working with, who could see I was struggling, suggested I see a therapist. And I will never forget the feeling I had the first time I saw my therapist. For 2 hours, she really listened to me, and I listened to myself. I felt peace of mind. For the first time since I was a boy, I got out of my head. She also helped me find a place inside of me for my mother. One time she asked me what my relationship with my father was like. I said it was poor and we didn't really get on. My homework that week was to write 2 letters to my father, but not to send them. One was about anger at what my father had done to me and my sisters all those years ago. And the other was about love, as, after all, he's my father. So one evening, I wrote those 2 letters, and emotions that I'd buried for decades suddenly came out. She then encouraged me to see my father and try and understand his life, his upbringing, and the culture at that time, and talk about the difficult times I had growing up. I saw him several times and learned about his childhood before and during the war on a remote farm in Yorkshire. They were very poor. His father worked 6 days a week in a factory, and they went to church on Sundays. What I also learned was that any emotions were actively discouraged. So for the first time in my life, I'd taken some time to really understand my father and the very cold culture that had shaped him. Because of this understanding, I was able to forgive him. This all happened more than 20 years ago, and since then, we've had a very good relationship. The best word to describe our conversations over all of these years is nourishing. Fixing the relationship with my father completely transformed my life. It made me feel whole and more secure. It somehow freed me from needing approval from the outside world so I could be free to be myself. A few years later, my sister in Australia sent me a book called Manhood by an Australian psychologist, Stephen Biddulph. He also wrote the world's best-selling books on raising boys and the secrets of happy children. The premise of this book, then, is a harsh one, but with hope at its heart. That most men are not fully alive. They have no real purpose and very little joy. That is what we, our wives and our children, have somehow come to accept as normal. Chapter 4 is called Fixing It With Your Father. During men's workshops in Australia, US and UK, he asks a question which often feels like a hand grenade has been thrown into the room due to the shame linked to this topic. How is your relationship with your father? out of a group of 10 men, he said the answers are always the same. 3 out of 10 will say they have very little or no contact with their father. 3 out of 10 will say that when they're together for a certain amount of time, one of them gets wound up, a prickly cactus-type relationship. 3 out of 10 will do better. They will attend birthdays or phone at a certain time each week or month, and this relationship is like duty. 1 of the 10 men's eyes will light up and say that their father is an emotional anchor in their lives. Only 1 in 10 men have a really good relationship with their fathers, and we somehow come to accept this as normal in our society. What a catastrophe. What he then goes on to say is, in my view, the most important part of the book, that it's possible to transform this relationship by having a series of conversations with our fathers, by firstly understanding their lives and the culture in which they grew up. This is exactly what I had done with my father and what had transformed me and my family's life for the better. In most cases, this leads to a healing of the father wound. Even if your father's no longer alive, the wound can still be healed. In some cases, the father may not be trustworthy, in which case, sadly, the son needs to find another father figure. Ask yourself, how is your relationship with your father? A couple of years later, after fixing it with my father, I attended a leadership course where we reflected on what we most cared about in our lives, at home and at work. From the moment the course finished, I just knew I was going to be a leadership coach. It gives me energy, and it's my vocation. For the last 20 years, I've worked as a leadership coach with teams in more than 100 different organizations and in more than 20 countries. And most of them have been men. The bad news is most organizations still have a top-down male culture that looks like this. The good news is, due to the ever-increasing speed of change, more and more organizations and teams are making leadership development one of their top 5 priorities and have a culture that looks more like this. The great news for our society is that this culture leads to a marked improvement in results and a very positive change in people's working lives. Leadership is simple. It has 3 parts. It starts with the future, creating a future that people care about. Then engaging people in that future. And then delivering better results through developing people. How to do this is in this book by Steve Ratcliffe. So ask yourself, which picture does the culture of your workplace most look like? And how can you develop as a leader? When we first moved to the Netherlands, I could not help noticing how happy and free the Dutch seem to be, particularly the children. During the last 10 years, the UN has undertaken research into happiness with both children and adults in countries all over the world. The research shows that Dutch children are indeed the happiest children in the world. Dutch men and women who work full-time work substantially less hours per week than in most other countries, so they are more at home. Dutch children have the best mental well-being in the world. The Dutch culture encourages children to stand up for themselves and to say what they mean. They're generally confident with very little shyness or shame. They're very healthy and play a great deal outdoors. Dutch children are encouraged to develop at their own pace with little pressure at school and little homework. And this approach produces very good social and academic skills. This picture shows the happiest adults in the world. Like with the happy children, 4 of the top 5 countries are from the Netherlands and the Nordic countries. The research shows people's happiness depends on a wide range of factors: wealth, generosity, social support, life expectancy, low corruption, and freedom. Men and women who work full-time in these countries also work substantially less hours per week, giving them more time and more freedom in their lives. The UN has found the most crucial factor in the ranking of happy countries is how widely wealth is spread. The area of the world in which wealth is spread so much widely across society is in these countries. They take care of the sick, the elderly, and the less fortunate. So ask yourself, how can we, by looking beyond our country's borders, have happier lives after the pandemic? Biddle says it's important for a boy to have a role model to become a good man. He asked a couple of hundred women to choose what attributes they most want from men today. And here are the attributes that they chose. He believes a good man can best be summarized in 2 words: having backbone and heart. Ask yourself, who is the role model in your life today? 10 steps to a more meaningful life. Gandhi said, be the change you want to see. He knew the only person we can really change is ourselves. Living a more meaningful life doesn't happen overnight, it takes time. Some steps might take a lifetime, some are more easy. Step 1, understanding who I am. During my first career, I spent thousands of hours working flat out. I spent virtually no time on understanding who I was, what I cared about, the future that I wanted. I was so busy. I didn't take time to reflect, to get feedback, to understand when I was at my best, what my limiting beliefs were, or find a coach or a mentor. We can easily find out which type of person we are and our top 5 strengths by completing simple questionnaires linked to the internet, like Myers-Briggs or StrengthsFinder. Ask yourself, what do you really care about, and what would be a great future for you? 2, energy. How are we currently using the commuting and the travel time that we've saved? Today, men watch TV or on social media on average 6 hours a day. We seem to be addicted to our phones and watching bad news on our screens. For us to lead full lives, we need energy. The most energizing part of my week is playing 5-a-side football and tennis. What enables me to do this is my yin yoga class. It keeps my body flexible, but the real benefit, it gets me out of my head. So ask yourself, do you consciously manage your energy? 3, spirit. When do you feel most joyful or fully alive? Is it when you're connected to nature, walking in the woods, by the sea, by the campfire, skiing? Or is it with friends or family on a night out, dancing at a concert, a sports match? These experiences help us to lose our sense of being alone. They make us feel connected, part of life. Ask yourself, do you plan this part of your life, or do you only plan your work life? 4, finding a job with a heart. During my first career, I used to think my job was okay because I didn't know any different. And many people are like this. Ask yourself, which parts of your current job do you most enjoy, and what would be your ideal job? 5, being a good husband, partner. When I first got to know my wife, she said I had a wall around me, which I was completely unaware of. I could not express my feelings unless I was drunk. I was emotionally closed. Fortunately, she supported me in pulling down the wall, so I could be married to her and not just to my work. She's the rock in my life, and my goal is to be the rock in hers. I've also learned that what children want is happy parents. 6, being a good father. I had absolutely no idea how to be a good dad. Fixing it with my father was a crucial step. So was observing my father-in-law and reading Biddle's books. Being with my children and seeing them growing up has given me the most joy and meaning in my life. And I know many, many men who feel the same. 7, male friends. In our current culture, women typically have several close friends they can talk to about their lives. Men do not. Research shows that men who do have real friends have far better mental health and live longer lives. Ask yourself, which mate or mates can you turn into real friends? 8, finding a good therapist coach. The day I first saw a therapist, my journey to a more meaningful life began. I started listening to my heart instead of just my head and the male culture around me. She coached me through some steps that freed me to be myself. She helped me to break my addiction by talking about it and understanding my conflicting needs. I still see a coach from time to time. We need to break the stigma that seeking support is a sign of weakness. It's not. It's a sign of courage and strength. 9, fixing it with your father. That transformed my whole life. And having the courage to do this can transform your life and the lives of people that you care about. 10, share, talk, and listen. The statistics show we have a profound problem with the male culture. We need to stop the unnecessary suffering now. We have the technology that you are using to listen and watch this talk right now. If parts of this talk make sense to you personally, or with boys or men you know, my request is that you please share it. Share it with all your contacts. Read or listen to the books from Biddle. There was one moment in my life that seems to capture this story. It was several years after this photo was taken. My father was in his 80s and my Dutch son was 20. We just stayed at my father's house in England. We were saying our goodbyes and my son gave my dad a really big bear hug. My father looked at me with joy and sadness in his eyes and he said, "Stephen, we could never do this." And I understood. There's a much bigger life to be led, and it starts by understanding ourselves as men. Thanks for listening, and good luck.